This is an exclusive presentation of WOWO 1190 AM and 107.5 FM, Unholstered.
Welcome back. It's time for another edition of Unholstered. Hopefully you're having a fantastic weekend. My name is Kayla Blakesley. I represent the local media side here on Unholstered.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sophia Rosales-Scatina. I'm captain with the Fort Wayne Police Department, and welcome to Unholstered.
Sophia and I have created this show, and it's really all about sharing and telling the stories that just don't often get told when it comes to law enforcement, obviously, specifically on a local level. But we talk all things law enforcement locally, regionally, nationally. And right now, the big topic of conversation has been marijuana, Sophia.
Marijuana, 420, whatever other thing you want to call it, yes.
There are a lot of names, as we learned last week.
Yes, there are. Learning every day.
Yeah, in fact, this is a Pot Talk series that we've had. In fact, this is episode number 3 of us talking about marijuana. Specifically, we've been talking a lot about legalizing it. That seems to be the hot topic right now that the elections are behind us. It's a really big topic here in Indiana as well. So if you've missed previous episodes of Pot Talk, you can go ahead and download the Unholstered podcast. Anywhere you download a podcast, listen from your mobile device, from your computer, from your car, whenever works for you. Sophia, I'm really anxious to get to our guest today. So far, we've talked about the legalization of marijuana with a long-term recovering addict. We talked last week with a state representative out of the state house. Bob Morris kind of got the political side of things, and now we're getting more of the medical side.
We are, and I'm happy I was able to touch base with someone, and it was actually a referral from Nate. I was asking who I could reach out to in the medical field for this, and he gave me Dr. Tim Kowaleski. He's with Parkview. He's addiction medicine, family medicine. And I think we just want to dive right in after his brief introduction. So I'll let you introduce yourself, kind of give us your credentials.
Dr. Tim Kowaleski. As Sophia said, I work for Parkview. I'm the addiction medicine specialist for Parkview. I sort of run an outpatient clinic. I do consults in the hospital, and I run our 30-day program.
Addiction medical specialist?
Yes.
We need more of you. I don't feel like there are many of you around. I don't even know if I've ever heard of this position.
I think in Fort Wayne, there's 4 of us who are boarded in addiction medicine.
Yeah, and so, he is very busy, and I just want to take time to thank him for actually joining us today because it's important, and his work's important, and we really had to do some schedule shuffling around to get him in here today to the studio. So I'm excited about that. But let's jump right in because I want to talk about the brain. The effects of marijuana on the brain, developing brain, young people. So kind of just give us what you know of
some
marijuana.
Context.
I want to know it all.
So, I think we need to start off with talk about, this is probably the most complicated substance of abuse. There are literally people with PhDs in cannabis. They're doing research. We don't really understand this system. How it really works. Opiates, I can tell you which receptors it works on, where it works on the brain. Cannabis is a little bit more complicated. And part of it was because it was a Schedule 1, so we never did any research on it. So the research is just sort of developing in this area. So that's sort of where to start, So it's part of the endocannabinoid system, which is normally, that runner's high people talk about. Mm-hmm. That's the endocannabinoid system.
That's why I am a runner, is that runner's high.
That release of anxiety. So addiction, when we look at it, it works in the area of the brain that's the basal ganglia, sort of the animalistic part of our brain. So the basal ganglia is sort of the area where we get pleasure from eating, sex, sleeping, sort of that animalistic stuff. Mm-hmm. And when you have addiction, we have an abnormal amount of dopamine related to these substances in that area of the brain that's released. And dopamine is that happy neurotransmitter. So I'm sure you've seen it, like the person with the alcohol use disorder who walks around with that brown paper bag and won't eat because it will mess with their buzz. Mm-hmm. At that point in their disease process, they get more dopamine from drinking than they get from eating.
Right.
So that's sort of where addiction lives in the brain. And THC, that's sort of where it works. People smoke it, eat it, and we get this decreased anxiety levels, your blood pressure drops a little bit, it's just this general relaxation, sort of similar to the runner's high.
So are you saying then, because of that release of dopamine that one gets when they get high, that marijuana is in fact addictive?
Oh, absolutely.
Because we've heard arguments, I feel like, both ways, that there isn't, scientific data proving that it is addictive, but then we've also heard there isn't a lot of really data that it isn't addictive.
So you've got to look at, we have a bunch of data. There's a cannabis use disorder. The issue is, so there's 12 criteria. You go through the criteria, determine what level of substance abuse issue you have, if it's mild, moderate, severe. The issues with cannabis is probably the biggest one I look at when I determine if someone has a substance use disorder is continued use in the face of negative consequences. So cannabis has a lot less negative consequences than someone using heroin or fentanyl and shooting up. They get possession charges, they get overdoses, they have all these negative charges, whereas marijuana, you smoke and you sit at home and watch TV.
Right, and if you get caught, just probably a ticket.
Yeah.
For the most part.
So, and the withdrawal is more that anxiety, maybe not sleeping, your appetite it's not the same degree as with like a different substance like alcohol or opiates.
And I know when you on the opiate side, when you're doing that, I know like crack cocaine was the same, heroin, that kind of stuff. You're always chasing that initial high you got with your first dose. Is marijuana the same, or is it different?
That's sort of hard. Okay. No, so everybody's receptors are different. Everybody's going to tolerate the medicine. I mean, tolerance develops with cannabis. There's no question tolerance develops. So that's sort of what happens with these other substances, why we need more and more to chase that high, because we develop tolerance. I think tolerance develops at a different rate associated with cannabis. And again, we're looking at negative consequences. Okay, so you're smoking more and more weed, but you're still not having negative consequences.
What are some of the, kind of speaking of negative consequences, kind of in a different way, but what are some of the negatives of whether you are smoking, eating, chewing, and all the ways that you can consume marijuana these days? What are some of the negative consequences of doing that, though, physically?
So we got to look at a couple different age groups. I wrote down some statistics because it's actually pretty scary. I mean, so 25 to 50% of people who smoke cannabis on a daily basis will develop a substance use disorder related to it. But then we look back at, teenagers who have a developing brain, right? And the scary part is, with the way cannabis is going, most of society thinks it's harmless, and it's not harmless. So kids less than 17 who smoke daily have a 400% chance of developing a cannabis use disorder.
Wow.
They are 3 times more likely to drop out of school, 3 times greater risk of dropping out of school, 8 times greater risk of trying other drugs, and 7 times greater risk of suicide. So those are some negatives that we have the data to support. You've got this brain, and then you look at these young adults who, and it's, a chicken and egg, the ones who develop psychosis and, schizophrenia, maybe they're predisposed from family history, and the cannabis was just a thing that sort of tipped them over. Maybe the cannabis did it. We don't know.
I was going to ask because I know we've had a lot of instances where the carts and the high dose of THC has sent kids, in particular teenagers, into psychosis.
Yes.
So I just...
No kidding.
Yeah,
really?
Yeah, it's really harmful to kids, especially at the high doses that are in those carts and the vape cartridges. So parents, if your kids are having vapes, you need to make sure that, number one, they probably shouldn't, but number two is to make sure that it's not marijuana.
Yeah.
What is it? Your brain is fully developed around like 24 or 25, right? So, okay. So then what about these negative, physically, negative impacts for someone, let's say, over the age of 25?
I mean, trouble concentrating. You become dependent on it for that anxiety relief, for that, issue sleeping. I wouldn't, physically, maybe you gain weight. There is some theory about white matter development early on where, chronic use will lead to inability to concentrate and stuff like that. So it's more mentally, yeah. Mentally. And I think, in the next 20 or 30 years, we're going to see people, in the 70s smoking that weed every day. We know what happens. We don't see a bunch of people with dementia. I think long-term smoking this potency we're going to see some long-term outcomes with neurological effects.
Because there is no doubt the potency of today's marijuana is not the potency of 60s and 70s.
Absolutely not.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So I just want to make that perfectly clear.
Yeah. Are you able, because that's something Sophia and I have hit on, I feel like in every conversation we've had thus far.
It's not the same.
It's just not the same marijuana. Can you kind of pinpoint the differences when it comes to, the marijuana of the 60s and 70s versus today?
No, I mean, it's just, guys who are breeding it specifically for higher THC quantity.
So, but there is a lot more THC in today's version of marijuana than back then.
And, again, we know that it affects brain development. So we're using this substance. This is, 60s, 70s weed. We knew it would mess with brain development. So now we're looking at people who are smoking stuff, 80% stronger. There is going to be effects. I would not be surprised that, in 20 years we see more early onset dementia and stuff like that as a result of smoking. Again, I have no data to support this.
Well, it hasn't been studied like that yet, right?
No.
To that extent.
We don't have long-term effects
Right.
at this point with the marijuana of today.
Yes.
We just maybe have some studies that came out from maybe the 70s, but it's not the same. So I don't think you can really say that.
Well, even then, we probably don't have longitudinal studies looking at, because again, this was a class 1. There was no medical purpose. So,
That's a good point.
Okay.
There is no long-term studies of just normal cannabis.
Okay.
But, I see a lot of people who have been smoking weed for 60 years, and they seem to be
just fine.
Neurologically, no, I wouldn't say just fine.
Well, you
fairly
see
intact.
But, and you see them, and maybe it's people, because I remember growing up, you always knew who the potheads were because they were lethargic. They just didn't want to do anything.
Yes.
They were just kind of lazing about and didn't have any kind of desire to kind of push forward. So that's how I've always equated, marijuana use is just it just
takes away that drive, takes away the passion.
Like the commercial, it makes nothing happen.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to me that even people would just I get there's benefits to it, but as I've said before, I'm a firm believer that we are over medicated and we are avoiding the issues that we need to actually address to be healthy individuals, and that's emotional work.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, we want to cover it up and want the quick fix, give me the pill, give me the joint, let me get rid of this feeling I have. But it's still there, so we're constantly chasing this.
Yeah, we're treating the symptom and not the problem.
Yeah.
Which is kind of a good segue, Sophia, too, because obviously we've talked about the negative impacts physically from just recreationally smoking marijuana. But then what are your thoughts in terms of it being medically prescribed? And I see you smiling. I can't wait to hear what you're about to say.
No, so, there is data, right? There is, glaucoma, there...
Sophia just said anxiety, sleep-deprived folks,
Let's preface that, right? This is a central nervous system depressant.
Yeah.
Chronic use can lead to worsening anxiety. Smoking it a couple times a week after a hard day of work is the equivalent of having a couple drinks, which it's not going to lead to worsening anxiety, but a chronic user who's smoking a couple joints every day, that will lead to worsening anxiety because, that their body's going to become more and more dependent on it to treat their anxiety. And then we remove it, and they go.
Now, is that from an emotional addiction standpoint, or sort of physical addiction?
Well, it's going to be
or both.
Both.
Okay.
I mean, their body is going to stop. So it's more like with alcohol. The more you drink, the less your body produces other GABA, which is the thing that sort of relaxes you, and you become more dependent upon. The alcohol is a similar thing. Like your body's going to produce a little bit less of its own stress relieving, and you're just going to get triggered. And anytime you get stressed, that's going to be your coping skill. I mean, this, like you said, this is all of substance abuse is, when you get down to it, an issue with coping.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. I mean, you might have a genetic predisposition, but it's really, when you look at it, these people don't know how to cope. They were abused as a kid, or, they're type A personalities. They work at 100 miles per hour. I mean, I've met those.
Yeah. Do we know anybody like that, Kayla?
Yeah, right? Yeah, you feel.
But that's, I know I've met successful potheads, and, they work their butt off, and they use it like a drink, at the end of the day.
They probably don't drink.
No, and they don't drink. Exactly. And so it's all a disease of coping.
Yeah. Okay.
We are a society that wants a pill to fix it.
Totally agree.
Which is the root issue that we've also always come back. And like I said, we are treating the symptom and not really the underlying problem here, which you just said is coping.
Yeah.
I actually have never heard it put so bluntly. I like that. I still am trying to get to your true feelings or beliefs or scientific thoughts on whether you think though like a medical card, a medical prescription for marijuana is a good or bad thing.
I think you guys talked with Nate. I think and Sophia and myself talked about it. I think there was a solid point in that this isn't regulated. Right?
Yeah, the dosage of it isn't regulated. Yeah,
if
it was though, Tim,
we would have to do studies based off what
dosage
would work most appropriately.
Yeah.
And like you said, everyone's different. So is that even possible?
Yeah.
And, and my thing is, too, and I think I talked to you off of air, Kayla, last time, and we talked about, okay, we do chemo.
Yeah.
We do all these things. I mean, I've gone in for treatment to get iron infusions, but I have to go to the facility to do it, and I can only use it there, right? Is this something that we could use in a facility like that where it's regulated there, the dosage is regulated for those specific things like epilepsy, like glaucoma, like those kinds of things? Is that something that you could see as beneficial?
So again,
I wish people could see him right now.
So that kind of regulation to me, I mean, that sounds like a methadone clinic. And if I'm putting that level of regulation on it, I'm saying that marijuana is as dangerous as opiates.
Wow.
So I have a hard time with that thought process. Do I think, there are prescription THC combinations for, epilepsy. There are drugs out there that have been produced using THC for these issues. I hear, it's a point, but then I just look at, this is, if we don't control where people drink alcohol. And again, alcohol costs the healthcare system billions of dollars every year. And that's not even looking at the legal, the legal costs on your side.
Right.
So, I'm trying to put it in perspective of the other substances, and, where I put it.
Okay.
So then do you think moving forward, and let's just put it as a state, on a state level, let's say in the next couple of years they do, in fact, legalize marijuana, let's just say medically.
Sure.
What kind of impact do you think that will have on Hoosiers?
I think all my patients are going to have medical marijuana cards.
Yeah. I believe that as well.
And so I run into this a lot with patients who are like, I just wish it was legal here. Well,
right.
I have to explain to them, that doesn't change the substance. Alcohol is legal, and alcohol use disorder is the leading substance abuse disorder.
Right.
Because it's legal. Mm-hmm. So, but again, these patients don't have those negative consequences, so they're like, oh, if it was legal, it'd be okay. But it's like, no, I have a lot of patients also who are like, they're involved with the legal system, they get off the legal system, they start smoking marijuana again. They're like, oh, I'm just going to smoke. And then the marijuana leads them back to other stuff. So even though marijuana might not be the issue, it leads them back to heroin, meth.
We know, we had on, as I mentioned, State Representative Bob Morris from the State House. We know that probably within the next year or two, there will be legislation that tries to essentially move the legalization of marijuana forward.
Sure.
We know it's going to happen. Let's say, Tim, that you got the phone call that said, hey, Doc, we need you to come down here onto the floor and debate and or prove why it should not be legalized. What would you say if you had that phone call and you had to go up here at the State House?
So first,
I'm really putting you on the spot.
No, you are. But, so I'm not against marijuana. I think there are reasons to use it. Again, alcohol is legal. That, alcohol, causes way more issues in my mind. But it would be more, we just don't have a good way to test them. Right, if they get pulled over and we're concerned that they're under the influence, how do we know that they smoked yesterday and not 10 minutes ago? How do we, for people who work in jobs where you're not supposed to be under the influence, how do I know a surgeon was well, they would never allow us to do that. Let me preface it. But like, the day before, the night before they smoked, and not the morning of surgery. I think it's just more of a matter of being able to test appropriately, like a point of care test. That's the part that would want me to slow it down.
Conversely, though, what would you argue for it?
Alcohol's legal.
Okay.
Well, but that is like the common argument right now, right? That we all know alcohol isn't good for us. It can lead to harmful physical, mental impacts, but yet most Americans drink these days. So you do hear the argument, and sometimes it is hard to refute that.
Yeah. We can't smoke in public places because we have smoking bans.
Right.
And I hate the smell of cigarette smoke just as much as I hate the smell of marijuana. So, but I know it's more prevalent. I mean, you go down to Indy, it's not even legal here, and you walk down the streets of downtown Indianapolis, and it's all you smell. Yeah. Everywhere. Cars drive by, and that's what you smell coming out of cars. So it's...
I was just in New York City last month, and I was like, whoa, like you couldn't walk anywhere. I just thought first of all, the whole city reeks anyway. But I mean, it was disgusting because it just smelled like marijuana. Everywhere you went, it was foul to me. And now I came back to Indiana. I thought, well, that's the one reason I don't want to legalize it. It's simply because of the smell.
At least I can't smell the liquor when I walk in somewhere.
I mean, and there are reasons, right? I'd rather have someone using cannabis than opiates.
Yes.
If cannabis controls your pain, I would rather you smoke some weed than get on a bunch of Percocet every day, which can lead to more issues.
And then wouldn't there be the concern, too, because I know just with Sophia, I mean, you guys aren't even allowed to use CBD oil or anything like that. I mean, there is also then this concern. Obviously, you don't want your surgeon, drunk operating on you, but I think it's all pretty clear when someone is under the influence of alcohol. I also just do think about this other element of someone who's shown up high to work, whether even a GM working on the latest Silverado truck, working with heavy machinery and equipment, or someone like Sophia, a doctor, what have you. How do we also go about regulating and controlling that? That's the other layer that I get a little bit concerned about, just because, again, I feel like we can recognize alcohol use pretty quickly. And at least for me, marijuana, I can't always tell if someone's high or not.
Sure. I think a bunch of organizations will still decide, like even if it became legal here, the Board of Medicine is not going to let doctors use marijuana. And maybe it would change if we had some form of testing. But, until that's in place,
But even so, I mean, it's the greater, as you use it consistently, though, your cognitive abilities go down.
Absolutely.
For me, I just think it's just like a no-brainer. You just don't use it. I mean, I can, and this is me, I don't have an alcohol problem. If someone tells me I can't drink for the next year, okay, I can pass that up, not a problem. But I do enjoy a glass of wine every now and again or something like that, and I do that. But
same girl, same.
I don't know. I'm a little more lately, but I don't ever see myself as like a marijuana user.
Yeah.
And like I said, I just think there's just
you would probably never even be allowed, even if it was legalized.
Yeah,
as an officer, there's no way you're gonna ever.
No, but you think about everything though. Mm-hmm. People building our cars, people working on our streets, these are all dangerous things with heavy equipment, machinery that we're using. People at sawmills, people, driving a bus. I mean, and we do have tests that we can do to kind of see where people are, if they're high or not on other drugs.
Yeah.
But it takes a long time, and you have to be willing to do that.
Yeah.
So I guess, moving forward, because we're coming up on the end of the show, how would you like to see this all play out? In your dream world, you can wave a magic wand, and, because at the end of the day, this conversation is here, and this is a threshold we're going to have to cross, whether it's legalizing it medically, legalizing it on the whole for business reasons or what have you. How would you like to see this play out? And you get your magic wand here, so.
I think, and let me just add one more thing. The number one substance of abuse in fatalities is cannabis.
No kidding. I did not know that.
It's, throw on probably other substances on top of it, but cannabis is there. So I think the first and foremost thing for me would be we need to educate the public that it's not a harmless substance, right? But alcohol's not harmless. We just need to educate people and let them make their own choices. I would want more, for me, it would be research on knowing dosages for epilepsy, for glaucoma, for all these different things, using it appropriately and being able to sort of spot test them on the spot. Those are the
fair.
I think that would be fair. You'd have to be almost able to do that, right?
Yeah.
At the end of the day, since we brought up alcohol a lot too, would weed, marijuana, whatever we want to call it, we learned all the names last week, would it be a better alternative to alcohol?
We don't know, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, if I don't know what long-term effects are, and that's the
so come back in 20 years and ask you that in 20 years.
Yeah, I mean, from an everyday use, sure, these people smoke marijuana. They sit around their house, they watch TV, they have the munchies. Yeah, they're not getting in the car. They're not usually beating their wife. There is a lot of positives, but I'm looking at it from a healthcare standpoint. What is the cost of the healthcare system from marijuana use going to be in 20 years?
Yeah. Well, Doc, Sophia said it. I know that you have a crazy busy schedule, so we're glad that you were able to make the time to come in here today. Truly, I said it in the beginning, there's just not enough people that do what you do. So thank you for doing what you do. Sophia, do we have anyone lined up next week for this Pot Talk series?
No. We are working on some things.
Well, I'm actually glad to hear that because we've had a lot of questions come in via email and our text back line, all, marijuana related. So maybe what we'll do is try to cover some of those next week. And then in the meantime, if you do have your questions or comments or concerns, what have you, anything related to marijuana, you can shoot me an email, kblakesley@wowo.com, or text us on our text line at 46862. Until then, you can listen to all of our previous episodes, not necessarily just about marijuana, but all of the previous episodes that we've had here on Unholstered. Anywhere you can download the Unholstered podcast, you can listen at your leisure by doing so. Just search for the podcast Unholstered. Your town, your team, your topics. This is Unholstered.
Thanks for listening to Unholstered. Be sure to subscribe to us on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen. And remember, you can listen every Saturday morning at 10:30 on WOWO 1190 and 107.5 FM.
Podcasts by Federated Media.